We have several interesting talks today. Some of our speakers will be presenting videos that were pre-recorded, but then they will be available for Q&A after their talks. And then we have one speaker who is here who will be presenting live. All talks are 20 minutes with 5 minutes for questioning, so 25 minutes total. And I'll give the speakers a heads up, well, I guess at least in the one live case, when your 20 minutes is approaching. Okay, so without further delay, our first speaker is William Robinson from Iowa State University. And the talk title is Russell, Tie, and the Location Component of Bodily Sensations.
Hello, I'm Bill Robinson. And as soon as I share my screen, we'll get into my talk. All right. The title of this talk is Russell, Tie, and the Locational Component of Bodily Sensations. So what I'm going to do is explain a representationalist view expressed in a 2015 paper by Michael Tie. Then I'll explain a different view by Bertrand Russell. Then I'll raise a problem for Tie's view and argue that the Russell-inspired, what I'll call the 3D view, the Russell-inspired view has a certain advantage over Tie's view. Then I'll have a brief discussion of transparency. It's a kind of objection to what I'm going to say, and then we'll get into the Q&A. Okay, here's the key text from Tie that sets the frame for this talk. Consider a pain in a leg. That's a leg pain feeling. There are two components to the feeling. There's the locational component and there's the painfulness of the feeling. The locational component can be shared. A tickle in a leg, for example, is also a feeling. What makes a feeling an in a leg feeling? Not that the feeling is in a leg, obviously, nor that a disturbance is going on in a leg. For one can feel a pain or a tickle in a leg, even if one lacks a leg. A plausible answer is that a feeling is an in a leg feeling, just in case it is a feeling that represents, the italics are Tie's own. Just in case it is a feeling that represents that a disturbance or state or condition of some sort or other is to be found in a leg. Since misrepresentation is possible, there is now no difficulty in understanding how there can be a phantom leg feeling, be it a pain, tickle, itch, or whatever. A pain in a leg represents a leg disturbance of one sort. A tickle represents a leg disturbance of another sort, and so on. Okay, what I'm going to do now is just say what I think this passage, what the argument is in this passage. First premise, one can have a pain or an itch in one's leg, and indeed in the same part of one's leg on different occasions. The in a leg component of these feelings is a distinguishable separate component from the painful or itchy property. Has to be, since it can occur with both. One can have pains such that their locational component is in a limb that one does not have. That seems correct. Conclusion, what makes a pain to be a pain in a leg is not that there is a disturbance in a leg. Now, in a way, at 5, we come to the key part of Tie's view. A plausible answer to what makes a feeling an in a leg feeling is that that feeling represents a leg with a certain disturbance or state in it. Now, the point of the square brackets is to prevent a reading in which we have a leg and we only represent the disturbance in it. Now, the leg is part of the representation. It's a representation of a leg. with a certain kind of disturbance in it. And then Ty observes this answer explains how there can be a phantom leg feeling because where there's representation, there can be misrepresentation. Okay, so far we have Ty's answer as just a plausible answer, but the view expressed in 5 is what Ty means us to take away as his view in this paper. To get there, we need what is not stated in the passage I read, but is clearly attributable to Ty from the context, namely that there's no better explanation of phantom leg feelings and that we ought to accept best explanations. Right? In other words, the whole argument is a species of inference to the best explanation. And if you give us 7 and 8, then the conclusion is that we ought to accept that having a pain in one's leg is having a representation of a leg with a certain kind of disturbance in it. Okay, I want to go on to explain a view of Russell's, but before I do that, I want to ask, what would be the right parallel for non-bodily sensations? In particular, what would be the right parallel for a visual sensation that a visual experience might have when seeing, or at least seeming to see a red cape, all right? After all, you could be hallucinating a red cape, right? We just want to talk about that kind of experience. What would be the right parallel account for it? And I think the answer is you would be having a representation of a cape that is over there and is red. That would be an analogous treatment to the pain case, right? Would be that that experience would be a representation of a cape that is over there and is red. I'll be coming back to that, but let's talk about Russell's view now. Here's a passage from The Problems of Philosophy, 1912 book. Now our sense data are situated in our private spaces. The relative positions of physical objects in physical space must more or less correspond to the relative positions of sense data in our private spaces. If we see on a road one house nearer to us than another, our other senses will bear out the view that it is nearer. Everything points to a spatial relation between the houses corresponding to the relation between sense data, which we see when we look at the houses. There is a physical space in which physical objects have spatial relations corresponding to those, i.e. those spatial relations, which the corresponding sense data have in our private spaces. All right, the key point that I want to take from this passage is that visual experience is three-dimensional. Right? Russell is telling us not only is there up, down, and left, right, there's also near and far, right? In experience itself. Okay, that's one point I want to take from Russell. A second point I want to take from Russell is that on his view, colors and shapes are instantiated. Now, what they're instantiated in Russell's view is sense data. And Russell says a lot of things about sense data that are objectionable. So I'm not holding out for sense data. But the idea that sensible qualities are actually instantiated in experience, that is a Russellian idea. And so I'm going to take that also. If we take both the three-dimensional character of experience and instantiation of sensory qualities in experience, we get a view in which we have visual experience as instantiation of visual properties in 3 dimensions. I'm going to call that the 3D view. Now, I hasten to add that Russell is not consistent about this. Many passages in his 1912 book take a flat view. in which rectangular tables look trapezoidal or rhomboidal, unless you happen to be viewing them from directly above their centers, right? That's probably the predominant suggestion in Russell. So we can't exactly call this 3D view a Russellian view, but it is inspired by things that Russell says. All right, let's move on to now the problem as I see it for Ty's account. According to it, some people have phantom limb pains. That surely is correct, right? What they have on such occasions are nothing other than representations of disturbance of the pain sort in the leg. But there's nothing else in Ty's account that could be a pain other than those representations. So representations of the pain kind of disturbance must also be instances of pain, right? Having such a representation, if you don't have it, you don't have a pain. If you do have it, you do have a pain. There's nothing else in Ty's account that could be the pain that the phantom limb patient is having. Okay. However, the parallel treatment of bullfighters' capes would have representations of red cape over there as being instances of red, right? If you treated visual experience like Ty treats pain, you would have to say that red is instantiated in an experience of red cape over there, right? But red is not instantiated in the experience of red in Ty's view. Red in Ty's view is a physical property, it's a reflectance profile, right? Others might have a variation on that, the molecular surface structure of an object that determines a reflectance profile. But in any case, neither of those properties is instantiated in us when we have the experience one would have when seeing a bullfighter's cape. So in that respect, Ty's view is disunified. Disunified, and it needs two different stories about what a representation is. All right, in contrast, a 3D view permits a parallel treatment in which some experiences instantiate bodily sensation properties, others instantiate visual properties, and all have a locational component. So for illustration, imagine kicking a soccer ball, right? The location of experiences is location in the same sense of location, right? So for example, the visual position of your foot as you kick a soccer ball, the foot's position in kinesthetic space, its position in tactile space, that is where the feeling of contact with the ball is, and the position of the ball in visual space, they are all the same position. Bodily sensation space, we might say, is continuous with the space of visual experience, right? So that's a more unified view of how experience works. And so I'm going to offer you now this tentative conclusion. Ty's account is disunified, that is, it needs different kinds of representation for bodily sensations versus visual experiences of external objects, whereas the 3D account is unified. Bodily sensation kinds and properties instantiated in visual experiences have locational components in the same sense, right? Now, that kind of unity to a view in the context of an inference to the best explanation is some advantage. Of course, it's not everything, but it is an advantage in this context. Okay, I want to get to the Q&A, but there's one objection I think I need to respond to before we do that. Come on, Robinson, one might say, don't we already know that experience is transparent? That is, it has no sensory qualities instantiated in it. We look right through our experiences. Right? That's the objection that I imagine might be posed to me. I think that objection has been very persuasive. Here's a passage from Harman that I think has been passages like this passage and others like it have been very influential, I think. Look at a tree and try to turn your attention to intrinsic features of your visual experience. I predict you will find that the only features there to turn your attention to will be features of the presented tree, including relational features of the tree from here. All right? However, the 3D view says that the features of the presented tree are intrinsic qualities of experiences. Harman has a different view, but this passage offers no support, right? That is, once the 3D view is on the table, right, where the three-dimensionality of experience is explicitly recognized, right, you don't need representation in addition to get the out-there-ness aspect of experience, right? So once you have the 3D view on the table, this passage I just read from Harman should visibly be seen to contain no argument. It expresses a different view, but not an argument for it. All right, conclusions. On Tye's view, we need two kinds of representation, one in which the representation instantiates the represented property, another in which it does not. The 3D view has a more unified view. It recognizes locational components in both bodily and non-bodily cases. This is an advantage in the context of an inference to the best explanation. Appeals to transparency recognize the out-there-ness, the third dimension of experience. Yes, they do, in a way, recognize the 3D character, but they merely assume against the 3D view that the out-there-ness requires, or maybe simply is, a representation relation. The passages I've quoted from Tye and Harman do not offer good arguments for representationalism or intentionalism. Thank you for listening. I'll just put up for a moment the references, and now I hope we can go to Q&A as soon as I figure out how to stop the, oh, here we go. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, let's thank our speaker for a great talk, and we have him available on Zoom for some questions. We have plenty of time for questions.
I'm here.
Yeah. Why don't you speak into this mic?
Hi, thanks for the talk. I'm no supporter of Tye's view, but couldn't you save it from your particular objections in this talk by replacing, we have red cape, you could have red appearing cape. You could replace red by red appearing or looking red. So if you take that move, then the looking red is a bit like the pain. I mean, as I say, I'm not save Tye, but I'm just wondering whether it's just a matter of how we express things using the word red, which is horribly ambiguous.
Of course, I can't be sure, but I don't think Tye would welcome that because now we just have to ask, well, you know, what is looking red? And I suppose he said, well, it's representing red. Does that make sense? I mean, the moment you introduce, I mean, looking F has, can everybody hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Looking F has, long been how shall I put it, a thing that physicalists have recognized as being difficult. So if they resort to introducing the idea of looking or appearing, right, then it just pushes the question back to, well, what is your account of what it is for something to be a looking red or an appearing red? What is that?
Great. Thank you. Do we have any other questions for the speaker? No other questions? Okay, let's thank our speaker one more time, please.
Well, wait a minute. Did Schiffer have a question?
No. Oh, is there someone on the Zoom who has a question?
I thought Professor Schiffer had his hand up, but maybe not.
I think Professor Schiffer has switched off the microphone. She's asking the question now, but it's switched off the.
Okay, I'm sorry. Thank you. I was muted. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. So my sense is that I would agree with Ty that I would call representation brain information, and that the brain information says there's a pain in my leg, and that brain information says it's red. Now, you could have a computer or a robot walk around and recognize a red cape. Now, what you're missing here is that it wouldn't be an experience of red in the robot. And so we have a separate problem. In other words, you can have a representation without experience. And I think that's where you're kind of getting caught. So the question becomes, how do you get an experience from representation?
Well, but I think that's a problem for Ty, right? I mean, if he wants to say experiences are representations, and then you point out, well, there can be lots of representations that are not experiences, then obviously
that's the robot. The robot has representations, but not experience. And so there's an additional component that you need to have experience, but you need representation.
Well, I would agree with that, all right? Mm-hmm. But what Ty says is that experiences of red capes are representations.
Well, I think he's missing
right? So,
that next step, though. That which differentiates a robot from a person.
I agree that something is missing from Ty's account. I don't see how that's support for him, his view.
Well, okay. Well, it's not support for his whole view, but I think that anything that we perceive must have a representation or what I call brain information.
Well,
necessary, but
insufficient. The problem is that representation is not a clear notion. I mean, one kind of subtext of what I'm after in this talk is representation is not clear. Ty needs at least two kinds, right? A kind that instantiates, where the representation works by instantiating the property that's represented. But another kind where the representation is in the red case, where the representation does not instantiate the property that is represented, right? And I think, I've argued that redness, for example, is instantiated in our three-dimensional experience. So I guess I wouldn't deny that, yeah, all right, we represent red. We represent it by instantiation, just like we represent, if you want to say we represent pain, we also instantiate it. That's fine, all right? But he needs an account of representing red that does not involve instantiation of red. And that kind of representation, I think, is an unclear notion.
I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut off this
Yeah.
time. Thank you very much. All right, so
Thank you.
our next speaker is Daniel Avega. He's from the Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. And the title of his talk is Representationalism and the Predictive Mind.
Yeah, welcome everybody. As said, I'm going to give a talk about representationalism and a predictive mind. And so let's get started. Okay, so I have to speak, stand near to the mic so that people in Zoom can hear me. Okay, so in his latest book, Perception, Adam Potts discusses the main views in the philosophy of perception. And the central theme of his book is what he calls the external-internal puzzle, which he states as follows, quote, experience has a Janus-based character. Many experiences are essentially externally directed, but experiences are also internally dependent. So experiences spring from the inside, but they also point outward. He goes then on to ask, how can we have vivid experiences as of objects and sensible properties out there because of internal neural processing in here, even in hallucination cases where no physical object is really present at all? So the external-internal puzzle, according to Potts, is that perceptual experience is essentially externally directed, while at the same time essentially internally dependent. Now, how does this fit together? Can we give a plausible account of perception that fully accommodates both features? And of course, since Potts' aim is to examine the main views in the philosophy of perception in his book, we can also ask, how do the established approaches fare in the light of this puzzle? At the end of his book, after having examined the main views in the philosophy of perception, he presents this overview. So we can see he examines 5 theories. These are basic naive realism, response-independent representationalism. I would call this later externalist representationalism, the internal physical state view, the sense-datum view, and internalist representationalism. As you can see, naive realism and externalist representationalism both can account for external directedness, but they have troubles accounting for internal dependence. In contrast to this, the internal physical state view cannot accommodate external directedness, but it can well account for internal dependence. And so at the bottom, we see the sense-datum view and internalist representationalism, which can account for both features, according to Potts at least. So internalist representationalism and the sense-datum view are the only theories on offer that accommodate both features. And so since the sense-datum view is metaphysically dubious and faces various serious objections that are also raised by Potts in his book, it seems natural to suppose that internalist representationalism is the best choice. Now, is this already the end of the story and we can go home? No, because internalist representationalism faces a serious problem. And to see the problem more clearly, I will delve into representationalism now. So what representationalism says in general. Representationalism about perceptual experience says that perceptual experience is a matter of being in a mental state that has representational content. So this relates to what has been said in the talk before me. There was also like this kind of view proposed. And so according to representationalism, for example, having a perceptual experience, I have here the example of a red ball, just is representing that there is something red and round in front of me, but we can also adopt the example with the red cape as mentioned in the last talk. So perception, according to representationalism, does not essentially involve standing in an immediate relation to the perceived object, as naive realism would have it, or being in a certain neural state, as internal physical state view would have it, or being related to a sense datum, as the sense datum view would have it. And as we have already seen in the table, there are two versions of representationalism. On the one hand, response-independent representationalism, as Potts calls it, or externalist representationalism, as I will call it. And on the other hand, internalist representationalism. Potts characterizes externalist representationalism as follows. One version of the representational view holds that physical things had perceptible properties before sentient creatures like ourselves evolved. For instance, things were purple before we came on the scene. Then we came to experientially represent the color purple by virtue of having visual systems that detect its occurrence in the world, in the way that a thermometer represents a pre-existing temperature. So the core claims of externalist representationalism are these two. Sensible properties are out there, and their nature is independent, response independent, independent of the subject responses of perceivers, so that's why it's called response independent. And second, representation is a matter of detecting features in the environment. Okay, let's now have a closer look at internalist representationalism. Here's how Potts characterizes it, quote, on another version of the representational view, before we evolved, physical objects merely reflected colorless photons and didn't intrinsically possess any colors. Our brains are inventive. They somehow enabled us to experientially represent wholly chimerical color properties, the apparent purple of flowers, the apparent bright red of a tomato, etc., that had never occurred in the world, in order to help us identify and keep track of objects. In normal perception, as in hallucination, the experience of the color purple is internally generated. So we can see here that the major claims of internalist representationalism are sensible properties are invented by the brain. And second, representation is intrinsic to the brain. So the brain has an intrinsic capacity to represent. And thus it is solely a matter of neural processing. Okay, now we have seen these two versions of representationalism, and to see where the problem for internalist representationalism lies, we need to compare it with externalist version. And more specifically, we need to consider what each of these two theories says about what experiential representation is. So let's begin with externalist representationalism. Here, Potts says that so externalist representationalism, makes experiential representation no more mysterious than thermometer representation. That's what we have already heard in the quote before. And he continues, for these reasons, it has been the most popular variety of representationalism. And in contrast, he describes the situation for internalist representationalism as significantly worse. He says, to begin with, internalist representationalism is mysterious and complicated. On this view, experiential representation is not reducible to the detection or indeed anything else. The way in which we experientially represent perceptible properties is very different from the way in which thermometers represent temperatures. Rather than opening the window shade to reveal the world it is, the brain constructs a virtual reality for us to experience. This is all very mysterious. How did this capacity evolve? Now, given what we have heard so far, we can summarize the situation as follows. While externalist representationalism cannot accommodate internal dependence, it has a good account of what experiential representation is, And this is why it is so popular. And in contrast, internalist representationalism has no difficulty with accommodating internal dependence, yet it is somewhat unclear and mysterious how it might give an appropriate account of experiential representation. And this is why it is still not so much favored. Now, towards the end of the book, Portes outlines in which direction proponents of internalist representationalism might go. He says, a great deal turns on whether these problems, so the problems associated with giving an account of what representation is, can be solved. The mysteriousness of internalist representationalism might be somewhat allayed by future research in neuroscience, showing that what perceptible properties you experientially represent can be systematically decoded by looking at internal processing alone. And the latter is indeed exactly what I'm going to do now. So here's my proposal. The prediction error minimization framework, in short PEM, as presented by Jacob Howe, is a piece of neuroscientific theory building that provides the basis for an adequate understanding of internalist representationalism, because it is both internalist and representationalist in spirit. And PEM points out how a plausible internalist account of experiential representation might look like. And this account, as I will show, combines ideas of a structuralist notion of representation with those of inferentialist fashion. Okay, let's have a closer look at what PEM is. To begin with, PEM conceives perception as the task of solving an inverse problem. When we perceive, we try to infer the hidden states from the sensory input. So based on the proximal stimuli we receive, we try to infer what distal state has caused this very proximal stimuli. And PM says that the brain accomplishes this task by testing hypotheses in the light of the received sensory inputs. And more precisely, the claim is that the brain performs unconscious inferential reasoning that approximates Bayes' rule. And here we can see that PEM is based on a claim called the Bayesian brain, which says that the brain is a hypothesis testing machine in its essence. So this is quite important because this is now more and more getting popular in neuroscientific theory building. And the outcome of all this inferential processing, which is called perceptual inference by Howe, is the hypothesis with the highest posterior probability. So a priori probability of a hypothesis weighted against its likelihood. I won't go into the details here because that's not important for my talk. And so at the end, we have this hypothesis with the highest posterior probability, which is also considered like the winning hypothesis of this process of inference. And this is also what provides the content of perceptual experience. And through repeatedly testing hypotheses, the brain then comes to construct a model of the world, which is also called a generative model. Because this model is then employed to generate hypotheses that predict the future incoming sensory input as accurately as possible. And if this works out, the prediction error is minimized, and if not, the model needs to be adjusted. Or however, there, according to PEM, perceptual inference is not the only way to minimize prediction error. Another way of performing this task of minimizing prediction error is active inference. This is the selective sampling of sensory input that matches an already selected hypothesis. So according to PEM, perceptual inference and active inference are just two sides of the same coin, so to say, because they are both ways to reduce, to minimize prediction error. But this is also something that's quite important for the theory, but not so important here for my talk. And to give an illustration, we can see here that there's inferential processing does not only take place at a single level, but at multiple levels. We can see here the black arrows pointing downwards. I hope you can see which ones are meant. And these are the hypotheses. And we can see the gray arrows pointing upwards, this is supposed to be the sensory input. And so if at one level the sensory input and the hypothesis do match, the signal is explained away and no further signal is processed to the higher levels of the hierarchy. And if they do not match, then the signal is passed on to the next higher level of the hierarchy. Of course, this is a simplification of how this works in many respects, but it's just to give you the flavor of what is the basic idea of PEM. And at this point, it is important to note that PEM somewhat goes against our intuitive understanding of how perception works, because it understands perception more as a top-down process rather than a bottom-up mechanism. So perception is not a process where sensory input is always further processed at increasingly higher and more complex levels until we get a percept, but it's rather top-down controlled. And so in contrast, PEM claims that perception is the predicting of sensory input, where predictions are passed from higher to lower levels, as we have seen, and they are all continuously compared with the received sensory input at each level of the hierarchy I showed you. Okay, after having given this introduction to PEM, I will now elaborate on why PEM is both representationalist and internalist in spirit. And let's begin with the latter. According to PEM, perception consists in the brain generating hypotheses about the expected sensory input. And these hypotheses are internal to the brain, and so is the sensory input. So the whole process of perceptual inference can be done from within the skull, so to speak. And how he puts it like this, quote, "The starting point for this book was the simple idea that perception has to arise by virtue of how the brain makes sense of its sensory input from inside the walls of the skull and with no outside help." So clearly, PEM rejects the view that perceiving essentially involves the perceiving subject standing in an immediate relation to the perceived object, as naive realism would have it, for example. And so we can here see the internalist commitment of PEM. And now concerning its representational commitment, I think it's natural to suppose that PEM is representational because it involves the testing of hypotheses, and hypotheses, at least in my understanding, just are the kind of entities that have content because they state that such and such is the case. And to give some further argument, there's a paper by Gladziewski. He says that PEM is representational because it passes what he calls the compare to prototype test, where cartographic maps serve as a prototype of representation. And according to Gladziewski, these maps have the following four functional properties which are characteristic of representation. Maps are structural representations that guide the actions of their users, do so in a detachable way, and allow their users to detect representational errors. So according to Gladziewski, the notion of representation implicit in PEM displays exactly these functional properties. And this is why he believes that PEM is committed to a representationalist view. And we can also here see in the first criterion where the way should go for PEM, namely it's about structural representation. And we can then think of the generative model that lies at the core of PEM as structurally representing the environment. This is the hidden causal structure. Because as how he puts it here, the prediction of the generative model of the world maintained in the brain is an internal mirror of the nature. It recapitulates the causal structure of the world, and prediction errors minimized relative to the model's expected states. So we see that in recapitulating the causal structure of the world, the generative model comes to structurally resemble it. And so this gives us reason to conceive of PEM as implicitly relying on a structuralist notion of representation. However, there still remains a problem. Structural resemblance explains how the generative model as a whole acquires its content, yet this leaves open how the parts, so individual hypotheses, get their content. And usually we are not interested in the whole structures representing other structures, but rather in a single state representing something specific, such as in the case of the visual experience as of a red cape or of a red and round ball in front of me. And how can we account for this with the tools provided by PEM? Schiffer and Howie, in a quite recent essay, give us this proposal. They say that the structuralist account of representation might be enriched by an inferentialist account in the spirit of conceptual role semantics. So conceptual, or sometimes also inferential or functional role semantics, is an idea originally from the philosophy of language. And it claims that the meaning of an expression is determined by its use, or we could also say by the role it plays within the language. So to characterize the role of an expression, it is necessary to look at the relation it bears to other expressions, so to look at how it functions and works within the language. Moreover, this idea has also been used to account for the content of mental states, and I think that we can usefully adopt it here too. So if transferred to the present context, we get the following view. Roughly, a single hypothesis has its specific content in virtue of the role it occupies within the whole generative model. So this is to say that a single hypothesis acquires its content in virtue of how it is used in predicting and the relations it bears to other hypotheses. So for example, my visual experience that there is something red and round in front of me just is a hypothesis that acquires its content in virtue of how it is used within the perceptual inference and the relations it bears to other hypotheses. And so this way we can also give an account of how specific mental states acquire their content. And now I come to an end. Internalist representationalism provides a good answer to the external-internal puzzle, but it lacks an adequate understanding of representation. PEM then is a neuroscientific approach to perception that is both internalist and representationalist in spirit, as I have tried to show. And PEM can be understood as being based on a notion of representation that combines structuralist ideas with those of inferentialist fashion. And thereby, I think we can furnish internalist representationalism with an unmysterious account of representation and like give an adequate answer to the objection raised by Potts. Okay, finally, I want to thank the organizers here for inviting me and putting up this nice conference, and also my home university, Goethe University in Frankfurt, and especially the Great Center, which gave me some financial support to come here and participate in person. And last but not least, thanks to my colleague Peter Kuhn for sharing and discussing ideas on internalist representationalism and PEM. So thank you for listening and see you at the party.
Great. Great talk. Okay, we have a little bit of time for any questions. Yes.
So are you saying that with the mirrors, are we standing between these two representations? The mirror being one is reality, and then we have you, which is the approximation of that. And then the difference between those two where you happen to stand, is that a value then that just, is that what you're saying?
So you're referring to the prediction error minimization framework?
Right, that difference between what is real and how you represent, that is what creates the content.
So actually the theory says that what gives the content of conscious perception is the hypothesis that is like the winner of this inferential process. So this is the hypothesis with the highest posterior probability.
Well,
and so then like you have to imagine this in a very dynamic fashion. So this is not like that's something like perceptual inference takes place, and then there is this hypothesis testing, but this takes place simultaneously all the time. And so, for example, when we have a hypothesis, the winning hypothesis is there something red and round in front of me. This is then sent down and compared to then incoming sensory input. And if the sensory input then doesn't match, then this hypothesis is like updated and a new hypothesis is sent down the hierarchy.
but there is consistency overall. There's consistency every time those measurements are made. that's why there's a winner, and that's why our colors don't shift when we look at them, right?
I'm not sure what to make of it. What do you mean by consistency?
Like when you see the red ball, it remains a red ball experientially. Your
because when
are,
this hypothesis sent down and then like the sensor input comes up, but it's like immediately explained away at the lowest level, because it says, okay, so if you're like standing still and focusing on the red ball, and so if the sensor input just remains the same all the time, then there is no like no error coming up.
Oh, that's really
Can
cool.
that
makes a lot of sense.
Can I get a question in?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah. I like what you said about Pouts. That seems right. And I like what you said about Howie. That seems right. But I don't see how the latter stuff helps with the discussion of Pouts. And the reason is I don't see how anything you said about Howie. I mean, I think that's an important view, and probably basically correct. But I don't see how it gets what Pouts is worried about into the world, namely colors themselves, right? How does where does blue come from? How does blue ever get into the picture?
So first I have to say that Howie is very unclear about this, but maybe this is also because he is not like so much into these philosophical topics, and so like that doesn't
exactly.
he doesn't like care so much about the metaphysical nature of colors. But I would say that somehow someone like me, or also someone like Howie, advocating PEM, would have to say that colors just are somehow in the content of these hypotheses. And then it would also be an internalist view. Colors are not out there in the world, but they are just always coming up in the content of these hypotheses that like make up perception.
Seems to me that leaves representation as mysterious as before, but that's a good answer. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we're going to have to stop there, unfortunately, in the interest of time. Okay, so our next speaker is, or next talk is going to be another pre-recorded talk. The speaker is Remigiusz Lecybyl from the University Hospital Lewisham, London. And his talk title is An Optical Illusion Creates Pain and Causes a Withdrawal Reflex.
Pain is a subjective, usually unpleasant, personal, conscious awareness of real or imaginary tissue damage. It is well documented that at least in some chronic pain patients, the pain is caused by some illusion, or patients believe in tissue injury in the absence of real tissue damage. Investigating pain illusion may help us to better understand the mechanism of pain. The idea of optical pain illusion started with children's toy, the miroscope. It consists of two parabolic mirrors that face each other. When a small object, like this frog, is inserted between the mirrors, it's creating a three-dimensional pseudo-holographic image which floating above the miroscope. It is a strange sensation to see the frog, but not be able to touch it. Here, the frog was replaced with a small pin. The sensation is even stranger when you try to touch a sharp object, but there is nothing there. Next, 3D printing and some Lego cocks were used to make a linear actuator. You can see here the linear actuator moving the small pin up and down. When the moving pin is inserted inside the miroscope, it creates a three-dimensional image of the pin, which is moving up and down. Finally, the proximity sensor was added on the top, and the device was calibrated. An Arduino board controls the whole device. Okay, touch it. Okay, you can try it again.
But I'm afraid, yeah. I don't know why.
Yeah, but if you're trying to do it, not fixing your finger, you will always.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
When a finger approaches the 3D illusion of the sharp pin, it unexpectedly moves up. This creates a strange, unpleasant sensation and a withdrawal reflex. The withdrawal reflex can be consciously suppressed, but doing so is rather difficult and usually requires multiple attempts. I hope that the illusion described here may help to design some interesting experiments in the future. The device is simple and can be easily replicated anywhere, only needing a miroscope toy, access to a 3D printer, some Lego cocks, and basic electronics elements. If any assistance is required, please feel free to contact the authors directly. Finally, I would like to mention 3 reasons why developing an understanding of pain is essential. Firstly, if we understand pain better, then we are likely to develop better, more effective methods to control pain in patients. Secondly, the idea of pain as awareness of damaging factors may constitute the most primitive form of consciousness. So understanding pain may then be a milestone in understanding consciousness. Thirdly, the reverse engineering. The ultimate proof that we understand pain would be in creating some sort of conscious artificial intelligence which would be able to suffer. This may open new perspectives for computer science by facilitating natural learning by punishment and reward.
Okay, well, that was a very short but very interesting talk. We have plenty of time for questions, and we have the speaker online. Are there any questions? Yes.
Well, yeah, so I take it you have, well, I guess I want to hear a little more about the people who give it a try. And I gather, but you didn't actually say so, that they report having actually felt a pain. Is that correct?
Well, it's slightly. Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you
okay.
fine.
I'll say it's slightly more complicated. I mean, when you touching it for the first time, you feel that the sharp sensation, which some describe as a pain, some as an unpleasant, We didn't make any proper study. It was just a toy built for my trainees to show them that the pain could be the illusion. But when you feel it for the first time, and trying it for the next time, you feel some depersonalization of your hand. It means you feel it still unpleasant. You feel something stabbing your finger, but you start to think that this is not your finger, that this is something like a movie. It means you see it, you feel it, but you not believe into it. The sensation is so strong that roughly half of my colleagues, seeing the reaction of this which try to touch it, decide not to try it. Another interesting thing is the withdrawal reflex. Because the withdrawal reflex normally is a simple reflex through the spinal cord, with out of the consciousness if you feel the pain. If you touch something hot, the hand is moving backward, and this is unconscious process. But here there is no nociceptive input, and the hand is moving backward. But even more interesting, you know it is an illusion, you try it a few times and see there is nothing, and still it's difficult to block this hand moving backward. It's you just feel that I will describe it maybe like you feel like a psychological zombie with your consciousness above it, trying to control the zombie, but the zombie still trying to withdraw the hand.
Okay.
Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say it reminds me a bit of hypnosis. I remember being under hypnosis, and the hypnotist pricked me with a needle, and it was not painful, and I believe that the hypnotist could do the opposite, suggest that there was a sharp needle when there was a blunt instrument, and I think it sounds like it's a similar mechanism that's operating, and I think your design is very elegant. I like it.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have a question from someone here in the audience?
I mean, I'm not sure I'm very good at making questions, but I like to try to recap it. And the way I understand it, I guess, is, are you saying that your prediction is incorrect? That's an error. And so there's the negation feeling, the depersonalization is maybe because it doesn't occupy any space that you had previously set as being correct, as being, yeah.
Yeah, I think this is the correct explanation if you assume, because with this theory with the error, my problem is that it's nicely compatible with artificial intelligence computer neural networks. But in the computer network, we giving the network the explicit answer, what is correct, what is not correct. That for human, in this mean, we should to understand that the error is a pain. If this make any sense.
I feel like pain is a correct response. We're not getting pain here. There is no.
Oh no, in this model, yes, but in general, it's mean if your brain trying to build a representation of the words, that if the representation is wrong, it will feel the pain. Here is the illusion of the pain, which makes up it even more.
Okay, Okay, we have another question from the audience.
Thank you. Very
Wait,
interesting.
wait a minute. Can I just ask?
I'm sorry.
It's maybe
can you hold
not
on?
that it's an illusion of pain. Couldn't it be a real pain from a very unusual cause?
Well, this is coming to the question, what is the pain? It means if the pain is some internal state of the brain, that in this case, if this state can be created by the illusion, that it will be a pain. It means it's like a phantom pain, where the pain is where there is no limb, or let's say the pain as a deep emotional state, for example, after somebody die, it's something internal in the brain. That if we consider the pain as an internal state of the brain, yes, this is the real pain. But in the response of something which is illusory.
But in the response of what?
As a response to the illusion.
Well, Ty and me want to say that the phantom limb patient's pain is really a pain. It's not an illusion. It's a pain that they have from an unusual cause, but it's actually a pain. Is that not conformable to what you want to say about those cases? I'm not clear.
Well, I'm not good in the theories. I'm a medical doctor who's seeing roughly 1,000 to 2,000 patients with pain per year. And from my impression, I will say the pain is always the illusion. There is nothing like a pain in the real world. It's the illusion created by the brain for some reason.
Why not say it's a reality caused by brain events?
Well, because you can see number of the cases where there is no reason to be a pain, and the brain still creating it. You can say that the pain is illusion, or you can say the pain is some immaterial state created in the brain.
Yes.
But and then to support it, there is no correlation between amount of the damage to the body and intensity of the pain. It means, for example, for a chronic low back pain, you can see a patient which have catastrophic damage to the spine and report mild or no pain. And you can see the patients who have a minimal degeneration changes in the spine and reporting the agonizing pain. That is, of course, the question how we use the words. But from physical point of view, I'm not sure that something like pain exists. What exists is an nociception, and a nociception is the physical process of the transmission of the noxious stimuli. For example, when you touch something hot, there is a damage into the hand, the signal going through the nerve, through the spinal cord to the brain. This is a physical process. This is something which physically exists. But the pain exists in some much more elusive space. This how I feel the pain.
Okay, I'm going to stop that question here so we can have another question from people in the audience.
Hello, just as a matter of information, I'm seeing myself for some reason rather than you. Matter of information is, you said that the person feels a sharp sensation. How similar is it to the sensation of actually being pricked by the pin? And secondly, to the extent that there is a difference there, is it a similar difference to when you have phantom limb pain from an actual limb?
I will start from the end. I don't have a phantom pain. And I think from this perspective, I cannot tell you what is the difference between phantom pain and pain in the legs. I think that pain is a very private sensation. For everybody is a different. And I would expect that for phantom pain, there is a huge range how people feel it. I don't think there is much similarity between the two patients with phantom pain to describe it. Now, regarding the sensation, I will say yes. Well, I can explain you on what I feel is it's different than being stabbed with a pin. I will describe it as a sensation of unpleasant sensation of something penetrating my finger.
Okay, we have one more question from the audience and then we'll move on.
I like how you were saying some people will have, I mean, this makes sense. You're saying, okay, if you get a lot of damage, you're not going to feel anything. Yeah, that's shock, right? You get a little bit of damage and, oh no, it's the worst thing in the world, right? But again, from an error sense, that's a good thing to do because you want to minimize the amount of damage you get. So the more pain you feel, the better response you get as a biological organism. So there's that pressure to correct the pain, and how do you contextualize it? How do you put it in an envelope, I guess? And when you talk about range with people with phantom limb, I mean, this is kind of just drawing on, I guess, but because there's nothing there, it's a disconnect in the stimulus, and so your brain is varying its prediction and it has no match, and that would describe why people maybe have different senses of it. I don't know.
Well, I must disagree with the part about back pain and little damage or little degenerative changes, because this unfortunately creating the feeling a lot of the pain, having a small degenerative changes, producing a much more troubles, and practically everybody have a degenerative changes in the spine in the age about 30. And if your brain start to causing you the strong agonizing pain because you have some degenerative changes in the spine, this causing the patient to stop to be active, to stop to be physically active, socially active. They very often stop work. That in this case, the chronic pain starts the downhill helix, which things making worse and worse when the degenerative changes really are not reason for the patient to stop work, stop to be physically or socially active. It's what is described as a catastrophization. It means is the patient imagination of these changes what causing them to suffer more than the physical changes they have in the spine. Yeah, I think that's how I would answer this question.
Okay, we have 2 more minutes left slotted for this talk, so we have one more question from the audience, so this is the last question.
Thanks very much for this. It's a really cool little piece of kit you've put together. I was wondering, did you do any kind of version of the test where you prevented people from withdrawing the finger? Or if you didn't, would you have predictions about whether if you prevent that motor withdrawal or avoidance, whether you get habituation effects, whether you get anything else going on in terms of the experience?
Thank you for the question. Well, we didn't make any proper study of this. I mean, I bring it here more as a toys to show. And if anybody would like to or have any ideas how to use it, I am happy to share all of the plans how to make it, or I can help to make it. But as I say, I'm clinician seeing a patient, and this was more built as a type of the entertainment to my trainees, to show them that the pain can be created just by the illusion, and this adds to two other known illusions for a pain. One is a heat-hot tubes, or the thermal grid illusion of the pain, but this is more the illusion of the nociception. And there is another illusion called rubber hand, when with some trick you can move your ownership from your real hand to rubber hand which lie on the table, and when somebody hit with a hammer the rubber hand, the people scream from a pain. That I say, we didn't make any studies. That is a very hard to comment.
Okay, let's thank our speaker for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
Okay, next up is another talk that was pre-recorded. This talk is by S.J. Langer from the School of Visual Arts, and the talk title is The Phenomenology and Prevalence of Trans Phantoms.
Hello, I'm S.J. Langer. This is our presentation, The Phenomenon of Phantom Sensation in Transgender Non-Binary People. I am here with Jaime Josefa Caso and Luisa Gleichman, Candice Fernandez, Jamie Bergen, Chase Ross, and Julie Tytler. And we're from primarily New York, and School of Visual Arts is the university that has the IRBs for these studies. And we're going to be talking about two different studies. One, which is a survey, online survey across trans spectrum of folks, so trans masculine people, trans feminine people, non-binary people, asking about phantom sensation to get a large sample. And then we did, with a different sample, different recruitment, an interview study where I interviewed trans masculine and non-binary people who were assigned female at birth about their experience of having a phantom penis. So to get started, and just to say, we're going to have some slides of quotes from participants. So if you are going to take any pictures of the slides, please don't take pictures of those because it could be identifiable and we want to protect people's privacy. So we're talking about trans phantoms, right? So we're not talking about traditional phantoms of because of surgery, right? These are phantoms that transgender people are experiencing of a gendered body part that they weren't born with, right? So a phantom penis experienced by a trans man who, right, is someone who was assigned female at birth. And so in our thinking about trans phantoms, right, there's a body matrix. It's a neural map of the inside and the outside of our bodies. And we're sort of using the free energy principle to talk about why we think this is happening, right? That the mind is holding a certain representation of the body that is not being materialized by the body. And that this is analogous to aplasia phantoms, right? People who are born limb deficient. Trans people are born deficient of some gendered body part many times. And if we think about the bounds of the body, right, having a particular gendered range, and we're thinking about, right, the web that's created of the organism, right, to minimize free energy, that trans people right? A trans man who is born without a penis, right? The balance of his body has a particular gendered range coming from his mind, right? That the body is out of range, right? Of what he's experiencing of himself, right? And it is threatening to his existence in many ways, in the same way as, right, temperature or hunger or some other necessary part of being.
So the table on this slide is really looking at the demographic characteristics of our sample. Our sample size is 1,460, and our participants were between the ages of 18 and 81, as indicated here. I'm just going to briefly go over some of the key points that you might see in terms of characteristics. So the majority of our sample, as you can tell, was above the age of 30. If we think through race and ethnicity, the way that we've categorized it here, most of our sample does identify as white or Caucasian, and most of our participants identify as being assigned female at birth in terms of their biological sex. And related to gender identity, most of our sample is masculine of center, so identifying as trans men or trans masculine overall. It's important to note that these, in terms of gender identity, the totals do not equal to 100%, and that's because folks often have more than one label that they use for their identity overall. Next slide.
So this slide represents the endorsement of phantom sensation by sex assigned at birth for our participants. So again, the participants are individuals who identify as transmasculine or non-binary. If the sex that they were assigned at birth was female, then that is denoted here, but that does not mean that they identify as female. So you may notice that the sample size here is different than the original sample size of 1,460. This is because some participants did not answer this question. So we simply do not have that data for inclusion. You will see that the majority of endorsements came from individuals who were assigned female at birth. But again, that does not mean that these individuals identify as female. These would be transmasculine individuals or non-binary identifying individuals. I'll give you just a minute to look at this and then we can move on.
Sorry, I wasn't muted. So this slide covers the localization of phantom sensation based on sex assigned at birth. And so the acronym here, AFAB, means assigned female at birth, and AMAB means assigned male at birth. And so that might not necessarily be, or in this case, most likely isn't representative of their gender identity. But what this is showing is where these participants are reporting feeling their phantoms by body part. And so you can see that the majority of participants that were assigned female at birth experienced phantoms for phantom penis and phantom testicles, whereas the majority of participants who were assigned male at birth experienced phantom breasts or phantom vagina sensation. And yeah, I think next slide.
All right, so this slide over here is going to talk about the endorsement of erotic sensation in the phantom experience. So where the phantom is located. Many locations were discussed like lips, breasts, vagina, but if we focus on the ones that are the most talked about, it was vagina, penis, and testicles. Yeah, so I'll let you take a couple of seconds to take a look at all of those numbers as well.
So as you can see from our sample, which is this originally the ones who endorsed phantom sensation is the 701 from that 1460, and approximately 50% are endorsing a phantom sensation, which is, so there's really only two other studies studying trans phantoms. which is the Ramachandran-Remigiusz study, and the case of Ramachandran study of bigender people. They obviously had very small samples, but the percentages are similar, but our study really wanted to have some more weight behind the sample size. So we think this seems to be a consistent percentage.
So we're just going to get into some recruitment information real quick. So this is recruitment for our phantom interview study. Our goal was to examine phantom penis phenomena in people who were assigned female at birth, regardless of their gender identity. So this was IRB approved through the School of Visual Arts. Individuals were given $50 gift cards, like Visa gift cards for their participation. This was in return for the time that they gave us, and of course their vulnerability and openness in sharing their personal stories with us. Recruitment was done online and or in person. It was a mix, and our sample was 615, and we interviewed 26 of those individuals. The sample was a diverse group of transmasculine and non-binary subjects across age and gender. Next slide, please.
So this slide looks at the demographics of the participants for the phantom interview study. So we looked at a subsection of 452, and again, 26 of those participants are who participated in the interview. The range between like all the different sections, say first, from this demographic, we can see that the age range for the participants, most of them are above 30. For race and ethnicity, most of them are Caucasian or white. For sex assigned at birth, most participants were assigned female at birth. And for gender identity, most of the participants identified as transmasc. Next slide, please.
So this slide focuses on methodology. For the interview study, we used critical phenomenology as our method. The interviews themselves were semi-structured, and the analysis obviously qualitative. So these are some of the questions that sort of speak to what came up in the interviews and what folks were asked to sort of report their experiences about. So some of them are, what are the individual characteristics of phantom experiences? When, in terms of context and time, do they occur? Does surgery or any kind of gender affirming procedure have an impact on these experiences? Do they happen across levels of consciousness, dream states, or while awake? And ultimately, are they useful in terms of sexual functioning or hold sexual pleasure in terms of phantom? Next slide.
All right, so this is a participant quote from a 51-year-old white Latinx trans man that I have used. It was the Peacock, which is a 3-in-1, which is a pack and play. And so it was during solo, whoops, sorry. It was only during solo play that it was like, it became almost like an extension of me. And so having the physical object and being able to hold it, coupled with having the sensation of the phantom, it made it really, really powerful, because it was like all of a sudden, it was like, the phantom became the physical, since I had the physical sensation in my hand, coupled with the actual phantom sensation, it was, next slide.
Just to clarify for folks that might not know, Peacock, a pack and play, is a type of prosthetic that transmasculine people can use for sex and for everyday use.
This is another quote from a 30-year-old white Latinx trans man. It does help to use prosthetics because now there's a connection that can be made, even if it's not completely real. But sometimes there's the opposite effect occurs. It really depends on how I'm doing that day. I don't have a rhyme or reason to it. Sometimes it's great. Sometimes it's absolutely awesome. And then sometimes it's like there's a part of me. There's that. There's that intrinsic versus external perception. And that external perception turns around and tells me this isn't actually real. And that really kills me. I would say that they work in conjunction, because when it does work, when I'm connected and I can feel everything, I can feel the difference in the orgasm because it feels more like an ejaculation. Next slide.
Okay, so this first quote is from a 59-year-old Native American trans man. Goes, so what I've come to learn is, we have a physical body and we have an energy body, and this phantom palace is coming from the energy body. So this male body is being aroused, and then this palace is infallible, or is impalpable, not only to me, but to certain partners. And then from a 35-year-old white trans man, and yet when I go to reach for what feels like, or like what feels, where my dick should be, it's just so much more subtle that probably the best way for me to explore it would be in a state of meditation, or including like when I smoke pot, and it feels like I'm able to access more subtle energies, and I'm able to like relax the energy and the like it reduces thinking so that I'm able to just like relax and be with it.
This next quote is from a 38-year-old Black, gender non-conforming, non-binary person. Yes, neurotransmitters and shit that's firing, that's saying ping, 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 that's what's happening. Yeah. And it's not happening like that for other folks that don't fall into the same categories as me. I know it. It was just not, it's a brain thing. It's a brain thing. It's totally a brain thing. It's totally the brain. That's why it's so real. Next slide.
So as you can see from some of these quotes that were sort of so beautifully read, right, that some of the preliminary results were folks feeling like I'm not the only one. Many of the people that I interviewed didn't know that anybody else experienced this phenomenon until they saw our posting for research subjects. And so we're really excited about that. Erotic sensation appears to be the foundational perception of this phenomenon, right? So if someone had a phantom, they had erotic sensation. Some other folks had more layered sensation, right? They had pain, or they had itch, or they had pressure, but if you had one, you had erotic sensation. That's what we found so far in the interviews. Many were lifelong or began at puberty. They found that it was useful during sexual activity, particularly with prosthetics. Could be mixed for some people, right? So if you think of the prosthetics with the phantom, and that the prosthetic is part of sort of the Markov blanket, right? That it gets incorporated into the body. And how they felt the sensation and understood the phenomenon was highly personal, as you can see from the quotes. And that for some people, it had a role in their decision-making about bottom surgery, meaning genital surgeries, either a phalloplasty or a metoidioplasty, which if people want to ask questions about that during the Q&A, they can. Okay. So in terms of theory, right, the participants' theories really seem to align with our proposition that there's these gendered predictions of the body, right, that is not, that they're feeling, right, even though the body part is not there. And that the phantom is part of their body matrix emanating from the mind-brain, or some interaction between the two, right? Is it coming from the mind? Is it coming from the body? In terms of phantom penis, right, we can think, we know that a clitoris is really also a penis, right? Just what got masculinized in utero, and is something emanating from there. For most people, it did come out of that part of their body. And in contrast to other phantoms, right, that we know about, trans phantoms, for most people are not painful, right? And many of the individuals wanted to even be able to develop the sensation as opposed to remove it, right? Which is kind of the opposite of what we usually think about phantoms.
So overall, this work really aims to validate the lived experiences and realities of transgender and non-binary people, particularly within the clinical context. Documenting these experiences can improve provider awareness and competency through exposure and training, particularly when we're thinking about identity-based concerns, things that bring folks into treatment related to how they identify, their embodiment experience, and broadly sexual functioning when that is relevant. It's also important to note that the data suggests that meditation and mindfulness practices might be associated with helping folks develop a deeper connection and control of their phantom sensation and phantom experience, which is worthwhile for us to know in terms of the connections of mindfulness and embodiment broadly. Next slide. So in terms of our limitations, right, I think we've sort of acknowledged that the majority of our sample includes white Caucasian folks, and that even though we did capture diversity across different realms of experience, we certainly could do a little bit more to try to diversify our sample in terms of race and ethnicity particularly. And that's always a challenge, particularly given the context of when study recruitment happened, COVID, and how these sort of types of studies end up getting recruited online and who participates in that kind of research. So that's our aim for the future, is to diversify. At this stage, we are coding and analyzing interviews, so more coming soon on that front. And we hope that this will lead to further research clinically that will inform practice and also development of scales and things of that nature. And we're working on publishing these results, of course, empirically, and continuing to investigate other types of phantoms that perhaps we haven't fully covered as of yet. Next slide.
So this is our team. This is how to get in touch with us. We hope we're coming right at time. So we hope that we have some, quality Q&A. Here's our group here all together, and we look forward to talking to you at the Q&A. So thank you.
Okay, well, that was a very fascinating talk. I understand that we have one of the co-authors online to answer any questions. Correct? Louisa Gleichman?
Yes, and S.J. Langer is here as well.
Oh, great. Okay, so we have one question from the audience.
So you're saying that these phantoms are strongest felt at arousal? And if that's the case, do libido suppression techniques diminish the phantom?
It's a good question. I mean, it's not necessarily that they're the strongest at arousal. I mean, you could say for some people, but that it's because some people had, like they could feel like pressure or like itchiness or something else also just as strongly. But it was it was common across everybody's experience, the erotic sensation. And we had asked if people had taken antidepressants or something else that would have suppressed libido. And as far as I can remember in the interviews, I don't think anybody described that the phantom disappeared or was lower. Louise, am I correct?
That's my recollection as well. Yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, another question from the audience.
Thanks for the talk or the video. Maybe I didn't get it right, but I wanted to ask about the phantom experience. How persisting is it? So are these experiences only very short-timed or very long-timed, or does it vary much from subject to subject? So that would be interesting. So like the temporal dimension of these experiences. Thank you.
Yeah, the temporal was, for most people, it was fairly consistent. For once they started to experience the phantom, when most people started to experience it around, either puberty or their first sexual experience. Some people, it was from much earlier on. But once they started to experience, it was pretty consistent throughout throughout the day, throughout their life. Louisa, can you recall some of the examples of folks who it maybe wasn't as consistent?
I don't recall anyone for whom it was generally inconsistent, but one thing that we did encounter a fair amount is that if they encountered visual non-presence, then some subjects would have the sensation that the phantom would disappear. That would be like if they looked in a mirror and they saw that it wasn't there, or if they looked down and they saw that, you know, there wasn't a natal genitalia that matched their phantom experience, then like the sensation would disappear. But generally, the subjects, from what I recall, were really like, it was consistent except for visual non-presence. And some, if there was an attempt to reach down and touch, then that also could impact the presence.
We have time for one more question. Is there a question from one of the panelists or the participants?
Yes, I would just ask to us, did you ask the participants about any phantom pain, not the sensation?
Yes, we asked about pain, and some people did experience pain, especially if it was like one of the examples was one of the guys played soccer, and if the ball hit him in the phantom, he would have pain in it. But not everybody experienced pain. Some people just only had erotic sensation. Do you recall the same, Louisa?
Yeah, but I do also want to clarify that in terms of sensation, when SJ, when you're referring to erotic sensation, I believe that the intention is to note specific types of sensations versus just overall presence, because you know, there would still be a sensation of presence that somebody was experiencing, even if there wasn't a sensation of pain or temperature or erotic sensation, but there was still a sensation that it was there. Sometimes people would feel it against their leg even. But yeah, not too much detail in terms of pain. But it was asked, we asked all subjects.
What about sensation of pain if the existing organ which mismatch? It means my clinical experience is quite often is a prostate pain in the transgender woman.
That's true.
Well, most trans women, even if you have a vaginoplasty, they don't take out your prostate. You always have your prostate. That never goes away. So it would make sense that you could have pain in it.
Well, you could have a pain in it, but from a clinical practice, the chronic prostate pain is quite rare. But my impression is, I could be wrong, is quite common in the transgender woman, which could be something physical, could be, I'm not suggesting any mechanism, but this is just the observation. Not sure about transgender women who still have the men organ, but I think it's at least a quite significant dysphoria about having them.
Super interesting to hear about. I mean, it's not something I had heard about, so it's definitely something I'm going to keep my eye on.
Just reverse to the phantom sensation, is that?
Right.
I'm afraid we're going to have
that is interesting. Thank you.
In the interest of time, let's thank our speakers for a very fascinating talk. Okay, we have one last presentation for today. I believe this is another pre-recorded one. Is that correct? Oh no, it's live. Okay. So then this is next and final talk is by Fredric Schiffer from McLean Hospital and the Harvard Medical School. And the talk title is Dual Brain Psychology, Profoundly Altering personality with hemispheric stimulation, findings and hypotheses related to consciousness.
I have some conflicts of interest. They're listed in papers, so I don't need to go over them, but I have a startup company related to technology that I'll describe. I want to just to get your interest up. We did a study from my company and from McLean, where we got a 75% decrease in cravings in opioid addicts, and had an effect size 1.5, which is about twice high. And the sham group did not have, they had a much smaller improvement. There was a placebo effect. So in order to, what we did was we treated the active group with an LED over the forehead, and the sham group got the LED with a piece of foil over the light. So I just want to say that we got some serious results. This was a 4-week treatment, and I'll come back to this, but I want to talk about the background of it. And so this comes out of the split brain studies, and I'm going to review them briefly. So Roger Sperry won the Nobel Prize for these, and Joe Bogan was the surgeon. Essentially, what happens here is if you show an image to say the left visual field, it hits this part of the retina and gets transferred to the right brain. So the right brain can see the image, but it can't speak. And the left brain will say, I didn't see it. If you showed it to the right visual field, the left brain would tell you what was in the picture. The right brain can't speak, but it can pick the item out of a group of items in the box. And so the right brain understands English, can follow commands, and as we'll see, the right brain is actually more complicated. Sperry showed a female patient photographed only to her right brain, and she had no idea why she was laughing. She said, "You've got a funny machine, doctor," which was a confabulation. And so what Sperry did was he showed her a Playboy nude, and she thought that was very funny, and only her right brain saw it. But her right brain was able to have a sense of humor, and the left brain didn't see the picture and said, I didn't see it. In another study, 2 words came up on a screen, and the words go to the opposite brain. And so the left hand connected to the right brain can pick out the tooth. The left hand, the person says what he saw, and he says brush. So I did a study with Bogan and Zeidel, and it was, I think, the last split brain study done from the California series, and it was the first inventory of the psychological state of the 2 hemispheres. So I asked 35 word pairs that were sort of opposite: ashamed, versus admired. And so these spun around so that both sides would see on one side of the picture a word. And I asked, how much do you feel? And the right brain would see the word happy and respond to that with the left hand, pointing to a peg from none to extreme. And the left brain would see the word dishonest. So how much you feel dishonest. And both hands pointed to the pegs. And we got very consistent and I think reliable answers to it. And in one patient, his right brain responded almost extremely positive, whereas his left brain was moderately positive, and his on negative answers, his left brain was more negative, and so we felt that his left brain was a little more positive. I'm sorry, his right brain was more positive than his left brain. And another patient told me that he'd been bullied when we were talking before the study. And I know bullying to be a traumatic experience for patients. And so I put in a bunch of bully questions. On the other questions, he answered similarly on both sides. But on the bully questions, his left hand signing for his right brain indicated that he was extremely upset by the bullies. His right hand signing for his left brain, as he told me, he was not upset by the bullies. So the idea is that the two hemispheres might have different personalities or perspectives. So more evidence that the split brain patients have different personalities or intelligence. They showed to the left visual field a picture of Hitler, and the left hand gave a thumbs down. Picture of Roosevelt got a thumbs up. So the right brain had political opinions. Another patient wanted to smoke a cigarette with one hand, and his other hand kept putting the cigarette out, and that's part of the post-commissurotomy syndrome. And there are a bunch of examples like that. Now, what's particularly interesting is, actually, I'm going to see if I can get rid of this here. There's evidence that in ordinary people, there are two minds related to the hemispheres. And the WADA test is we inject sodium amytal prior to neurosurgery to make sure that the speech is located in the left hemisphere and that the surgeon doesn't remove speech from the right hemisphere. And 24% of patients in a series of 270 patients, it's the last large series that I know of, and 24% had emotional responses when one hemisphere was anesthetized, and the emotional response was different from the usual state. And usually it was positive, but a number of times the patient would cry or have a negative experience with that. Down here. Werner Wittling is a German scientist, and he developed this very complex machine. And he was reporting that he was showing movies to one brain hemisphere or the other in normal or ordinary people. I was kind of amazed at that, and I couldn't afford this machine. It was very hard to understand what he was, how he was doing it. He was tracking eye movements and masking a computer screen. And eventually I realized that he was simply showing the movie to one lateral visual field or the other. And I figured out I could do that on my budget if I went like this. So I went to the office that day and asked a patient to do that. And he was a Vietnam vet, and his face got real tight, and he said, "That plant behind you looks like the jungle." I said, "Well, look out the other side." He said, "No, it's a nice looking plant." And I made these tape goggles, and patients could look out one side or the other, and it would either way, it would hit the medial retina, which is 60%, and crosses over. And so it was very surprising that with this simple technique, you could get dramatic changes in personality. I would say about 80% of my patients have a difference, about 20% don't feel that. Amongst neurologists who I've tried this with, none of them have any difference between the sides. I invited a patient to come in who I had treated for cocaine addiction, and he did very well. But I had sort of made this discovery, and I had these goggles. And what we worked on was that his trauma was that his father was condescending. He could never get his approval. And so I have him look out one side, and he says here, "I don't know, I was never comfortable around my father. With these glasses on, it's sort of like dealing with him again, because it's always the unknown. It's always a pressure and a problem. You feel the unknown, you have the tension." And then I have him look out the other side, and he says, "I could deal with him out on this side. I know how to handle him now. I don't think he'd get me upset, and I wouldn't do the counterproductive things if I looked at him out this side all the time. I feel more pity for him and for the relationship, and I don't think I'd abuse myself by using drugs." And so I have a psychological theory, which I call dual brain psychology, and have a book, and now in a second edition, called Of Two Minds. And the idea is that one hemisphere supports a personality that's healthy, and the other is unhealthy. And then we did an MRI study at McLean with members of our lab, and they went in the scanner and they looked out the left side and then the right side, and then repeated that, and then we crunched the data for 7 people. And this is what we found, that when you look at the left visual field, your right hemisphere actually becomes quite active compared to the ipsilateral side. And the opposite happens when you look at the right visual field. You stimulate the left brain. And we were, and everybody didn't have their problem in the right brain as I thought they would. And it's about 50-50. And in this case here, this is a study done by Alvaro Pasqualeone, who actually did the study. I brought the glasses down to him, and he took them, and the idea was that if you use TMS, treatment for depression, which you put an electromagnet over the left front of the head over the front of the left brain, that if you have a negative left valence, if your problems are more in your left brain, I predicted they wouldn't do well. And that's exactly what happened. That these people had very little improvement in their Hamilton score. Going down is an improvement. All the people who improved were predicted to improve by my simple goggle test. We repeated that with a clinic in Canada. And then this is the second edition of my book. And so now I just use an envelope. So I'll ask patients to get their equipment out and if they have any use for junk mail. And they can hold it like that and get in traumatized people, a very strong reaction like the Vietnam vet or like the cocaine person who had a cocaine problem. And I do this every day. And especially people with trauma get a strong difference. And you can have different conversations with each side. And the therapy that I do, I talk to the troubled side and sort of do therapy with it and try and teach it about the meaning of the trauma and how to try to bear it. And I try and get the healthier side to be like a co-therapist. And if the patient isn't feeling well, he can take his junk mail and look out his a better visual field, and it often really improves his state. Now, I wanted something that was like TMS, but I could do in my office. And so I came up with near-infrared light. I knew that near-infrared light travels easily through the skull. And so I was working with Michael Hamlin, who's it's called photobiomodulation. And we did the first study for anxiety or depression using near-infrared light on the forehead. So essentially, this is an LED with a heat sink and a computer fan. And so the patient's holding it on one side to induce the healthier side. In practice, I actually often put it on the other side so I can talk to the more troubled side. The patient can get drug cravings if you put it on that side, not more than the usual, but they can have drug cravings and or any other problem that they came in with, or be it just depression or some craving. And so here's a patient who had an erotic transference. I don't know if this is audible or not.
The illness, man.
Very erotic field.
Yeah, I still want to have Dr. Schiffer.
Okay, but is there any change in the quality of that wish? Anyway, so I treat her with the light, and
So how does this work when I leave here and I don't have this treatment? It's
well, you need to think about what we're doing.
okay. I have been here.
Yeah, I know that.
I think I'm a good patient.
Okay, but you're right. This in itself isn't a treatment.
Right.
Okay, but it's a tool.
You're showing me how my other brain, the good side, can really suppress the
Yeah,
other side.
and lead, so that you can then help the other side. Now you can notice that her demeanor and her voice has changed, and the erotic feelings completely remitted, and it usually lasts about 3 days where they really feel the effect of it, so that's where we got the idea for the study that I presented in the beginning, and we published that last summer in Frontiers, and this is what we found. This is the sham group, and this is the actively treated group. The treatment ends, the last treatment was at this point, and a week later, you actually get a better response over the week. I'm not sure why that is, and it lasted all 3 weeks, or not. So this is a 5-point drop in a 10-point craving scale. So somebody could go from a craving of 8 down to 3, and that would be a craving that would be likely to have them use and or not use. And whereas the sham group did have a decrease. This line here is a point, so it went down to a little over a point and a half by the third follow-up. And use, this is a decrease in use as it progressed, and the sham group had a small increase in use. This was highly significant, even though most of the use was not a criteria for entry of the study. There were 39 patients in the study. They were divided between the sham and the active. My hypothesis is, and this comes out of a paper that's I published in Medical Hypotheses about the nature of consciousness. I think that the LED excites a continuously changing biophoton field that it represents brain information, and that the information interacts with a fundamental but not yet discovered quantum field, which I call the subjective field, and transforms the biophoton brain information into subjective experiences. Thank you.
Thank our speaker for a great talk. We still, okay. We have time for just a couple questions. Any questions? Yes, in the back. Yeah, why don't you come on up here, please?
Hello, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you
Yes.
for the talk. I wanted to ask if you're familiar with Ian McGilchrist. He also,
Yes.
yeah, I was wondering whether you've observed differences in, I guess, like what these people attend to when you're stimulating one hemisphere or the other. Is there, I know you talk about personality, is there a difference in sort of what their attention is on? I don't know.
No,
Okay.
no. There isn't. It's just like you know, if I were talking with Tom and Bill, you know, that just they would be different people, and they have different interests, but it's not that one is focused on their shoe and the others on the window.
Thank you.
Mhm.
Any other questions from either the audience members or anybody online? Yes, from one of the panelists.
Yeah, just for clarification, when you are stimulating the unhealthy side of the brain, is I think how you put it, when you're talking to that side, is the intention or goal of stimulating that side and talking to that side to be to heal that side, that like you want to focus on that side because that's where you want the psychotherapy work to be done?
Yeah, it's therapy. Now there's psychotherapy and it's good in psychotherapy often, you know, if the patient can talk about their pain and their trauma and it's in a different way. In other words, they can remember their mother yelling at them on both sides, but it's a different experience on the mature side than the child side. And so a lot of the work is trying to talk with the child side.
Got it. Yeah,
And
that's what I thought. I
that's
wanted to be sure.
Point I didn't really mention that the troubled side is really like a traumatized child, and that's the kind of work that I do regularly.
Yeah. That's great. Thank you.
Okay, well, unfortunately, we're out of time. So let's thank our speaker for a very interesting talk. And this concludes this session. I would like to thank all the speakers and the audience for participating in a wonderful session. Thank you.